Prisoners target black police officer, unaware she is a ruthless fighter. The story begins with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that fills a correctional facility when men with hard eyes watch and wait for the smallest sign of weakness. Walls lined with steel and stone do not just keep prisoners inside. They amplify suspicion, sharpen grudges, and magnify every whispered word until it feels like thunder. It was in this space, where anger walked the halls like a ghost, that Officer Regina Cole carried herself each day with a posture of unbroken dignity. She was a black woman in uniform, tall, athletic, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that held more stories than she would ever tell. For some of the inmates, her very presence was a challenge. They saw her not just as a guard, but as a symbol of something they had long resented: authority, law, and above all, the audacity of a black woman commanding respect in a place where respect was currency more dangerous than contraband. From the first day Regina stepped into Ironwood Correctional, the murmurs began. Some said she would not last a month. Others laughed and claimed the weight of that badge would crush her spirit. They judged her not by her training or her resolve, but by the narrow stereotypes they carried like chains of their own. She knew the eyes on her back were not merely curious. They were plotting, measuring, waiting. What the prisoners did not know, could not know, was the story behind those unwavering eyes. Regina was not just a guard trained to handle violence. She was a survivor of it. She grew up in the South, in a neighborhood where police sirens sang louder than lullabies. Her father, a welder with hands rough from years of labor, had once told her, "Strength isn't about fists, baby girl. It's about standing when everything in you screams to fall." And Regina carried that lesson in her bones. The tension sharpened one summer evening when a fight broke out in the cafeteria. Two inmates, fueled by rage and desperation, hurled chairs and fists until the room became a storm of chaos. Officers rushed in, but it was Regina who moved through the fray with a startling clarity. She wasn't reckless. She was calculated. One prisoner lunged at her, his fist swinging wild, but with one swift motion she sidestepped, caught his arm, and dropped him to the ground with precision that silenced the room. Her strength was undeniable, but what struck those who witnessed it was a calm in her face, as though this battle had already been fought in her mind long before it ever reached her body. After that day, whispers turned to threats. Some prisoners began to mutter in corners, plotting in low voices. They called her names meant to pierce her identity. They laughed about breaking her down, about showing the world she was just another target in blue. The ringleader of their contempt was Donnell King Hughes, a man who carried himself with the arrogance of someone who once ruled the streets and refused to bow even behind bars. To him, Regina was an insult, an affront to his pride as a man, and worse, as a man who had built his reputation on dominating others. King Hughes began to spread the word. Officer Cole would fall, not by accident, but by design. He promised his crew that they would take her dignity, that they would remind her of her place. But what Hughes underestimated was that Regina's life had been forged in the very fires he thought he commanded. At home, Regina carried the weight of the job in silence. Her mother often worried aloud, asking if the prison was worth the strain. You could find work in an office, baby. Something safer. Something that doesn't chew you up every day. But Regina always shook her head. She understood that the prison walls were not just cages for the inmates. They were mirrors of society's fears, failures, and forgotten souls. To her, wearing the badge meant more than holding authority. It meant confronting the ugliness of a system that had once sought to confine people who looked like her, people she loved. It meant refusing to let fear write the story of her life. One evening, as the setting sun bled through the barred windows, the plan was set in motion. Hughes and his men arranged a distraction in the laundry room. A staged fight, loud and violent, drew officers scrambling toward the noise. Regina, stationed on the far end of the block, found herself cornered by 4 inmates who had slipped away from the chaos. Their eyes gleamed with cruel anticipation. "Looks like it's just us now," one of them sneered, stepping forward with menace in his stride. Regina's hand rested on her baton, her pulse steady, her stance firm. She had been waiting for this moment, not with fear, but with a grim awareness of inevitability. She had studied their movements for weeks, noting who lingered too long in the shadows, who carried themselves with the arrogance of conspirators. She knew this was coming, and she had decided long ago that when it came, she would not simply survive. She would dominate. The first prisoner lunged, his fists wild, his body heavy with rage. In one motion, Regina pivoted, driving her elbow into his ribs before sweeping his legs out from under him. The thud of his body hitting the concrete echoed like a warning bell. The others hesitated, but Hughes's voice rang from behind them, sharp and commanding. "Get her!" What followed was not chaos, it was discipline. Regina fought with the precision of someone who had trained her entire life for this test. Each strike was controlled, each block purposeful. She was not reckless with power, she was exacting with it. She moved with the fluidity of a fighter who understood that strength was not in brute force, but in the ability to turn her opponent's rage into their downfall. One inmate rushed her with a shank hidden in his sleeve, but she caught his wrist mid-swing, twisting until the weapon clattered to the floor. She drove her knee into his chest, sending him sprawling. Another tried to grab her from behind, but she shifted her weight, slamming him into the wall with a force that left him gasping for breath. In those minutes, the prison was not a place of confinement. It was an arena, and Regina Cole was not merely a guard. She was a warrior who refused to be broken by the hatred in front of her. The inmates who had planned to humiliate her found themselves humiliated instead, sprawled across the cold floor, defeated by the very woman they had underestimated. When backup finally arrived, the scene told its own story. 4 prisoners groaning in pain, weapons scattered useless on the ground, and Officer Cole standing tall, her uniform slightly disheveled but her gaze unshaken. The silence that followed was not just the end of a fight, it was the birth of a legend. But victory came with a cost. The administration wanted to treat the incident as just another altercation, another tick mark on the long list of prison violence. Yet for Regina, it was more than that. It was a declaration that her presence, her authority, her very identity as a black woman in uniform could not be erased or diminished by hate. The story spread beyond the walls of Ironwood. Other officers whispered about the night Officer Cole stood against 4 men and walked away unbroken. Some praised her. Others, quietly uncomfortable, questioned why such a woman had been placed there in the first place. Discrimination often wears subtle disguises, and Regina recognized the sideways glances, the coded remarks. She was not just fighting prisoners, she was battling the prejudice within the very system she served. At night, when she finally allowed herself to breathe, she thought of her father's words. Strength isn't about fists. It's about standing. And Regina knew she would keep standing, no matter how many tried to tear her down. Because for her, every day in that uniform was a fight not just for order, but for dignity, for herself, for the women who came before her, and for those who would come after. And yet, what neither she nor the prison fully understood was that this was only the beginning. Hughes, humiliated and seething, had not been defeated in spirit. He nursed his pride like a wound, plotting revenge that reached deeper than fists and knives. The war between Officer Cole and the prisoners had only just begun. The prison settled into an uneasy rhythm after the ambush. The floors were scrubbed clean, reports were filed, and on paper, the matter was considered resolved. But in the corridors of Ironwood Correctional, whispers carried faster than ink. The prisoners spoke of Regina Cole not as a guard anymore, but as a force. Some admired her quietly, acknowledging the courage it took to stand her ground. Others, bitter and vengeful, sharpened their hatred into something far more dangerous than fists. At the center of that storm was Donnell King Hughes. His pride, once unshakable, had been shattered in front of those he commanded. Power in prison is not measured in years left on a sentence, but in fear and respect. Hughes had lost both the night Regina laid him low, and he knew that unless he reclaimed them, he would be reduced to just another inmate, stripped of his crown. For a man like him, that was worse than the cell itself. Hughes began to scheme with a patience born of rage. He understood now that Regina was not to be taken lightly. Brute force had failed. To defeat her, he would need to exploit not her strength, but her humanity. He whispered poison into the ears of other prisoners, feeding their resentment, binding them with promises of dignity stolen and vengeance reclaimed. It wasn't just about overpowering Officer Cole anymore. It was about breaking her spirit. Regina sensed the tension building, though no one said it aloud. She could feel it in the way conversation stopped when she walked by, in the coded looks exchanged across the yard. Even some of her fellow officers began to hint that perhaps she had gone too far during the fight, that she had embarrassed the inmates more than was necessary. It stung her, not because she doubted herself, but because she recognized the undertone. A white officer in her position might have been praised without question. But Regina, a black woman, was scrutinized for doing the very job she was trained to do. It reminded her of her academy days, when a trainer once told her bluntly, "You will have to work twice as hard to get half the respect." At the time, she had brushed it off with determination. Now, standing in a facility where her every action seemed magnified by both admiration and suspicion, she realized just how true those words had been. Still, she pressed forward. Every morning, she laced her boots, pinned her badge, and walked into the prison with the same unbroken dignity. She refused to show fear. For Regina, fear was a luxury she could not afford. And yet, when she returned home at night, alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to sit in the quiet and feel the weight of what she carried. The bruises from the fight had faded, but the memory of it lingered like a scar beneath her skin. Her mother, wise and weary, noticed the change in her. "You carry the fight home with you, Regina," she said softly one evening over dinner. "You can't let them take your spirit when you walk through that door." Regina smiled faintly, but her voice was firm. "They won't, Mama. They can't." But deep down, she knew the battle was far from over. It came weeks later, on a night heavy with summer heat. The air in the prison was thick, restless, as though the walls themselves anticipated something. Hughes and his crew had spent days preparing. This time, they would not strike in the open. They had fashioned crude weapons, gathered allies, and orchestrated a distraction so elaborate that even seasoned officers were caught off guard. The plan was simple: isolate Regina, overwhelm her, and leave a mark that no one would forget. The alarm sounded just after lights out. 2 blocks away, a mattress fire filled the air with choking smoke. Officers rushed to contain it, pulling resources from every corner. In the confusion, Hughes and 5 others cornered Regina in the service corridor, a place where cameras had long been broken and shadows stretched thick across the walls. Hughes's grin was sharp, his eyes burning with vindication. "You thought you embarrassed me in front of my people. Officer Cole, tonight we take back what you stole." Regina stood her ground, her baton steady in her hand. Fear rippled through her body. She would not deny it, but fear did not control her. It focused her. She knew this was a moment they had been building toward, the moment when her resolve would be tested not by a single fight, but by the full weight of hatred aimed squarely at her. The first man lunged, a shift flashing in the dim light. Regina sidestepped, bringing her baton down across his wrist with a crack that sent the weapon clattering to the floor. Another came from behind, but she pivoted, slamming her elbow into his jaw. The corridor erupted into violence, fists and weapons striking out from all sides. Regina fought with every ounce of training and every memory of survival she had carried since childhood. She remembered the nights her father taught her to box in the backyard, his voice steady. "Keep your guard up, baby girl. Always protect yourself." She remembered the fear she once felt walking home through streets where danger hid in shadows. She remembered the vow she made when she joined the force, that she would not let anyone, inside or outside those walls, strip her of dignity. She was outnumbered, but she was not outwilled. She moved like a storm, her strikes precise, her blocks relentless. One man fell to the ground, clutching his ribs. Another staggered back with blood dripping from his nose. But the numbers pressed against her, threatening to swallow her whole. Hughes himself finally stepped forward, his size and fury making him a towering presence in the narrow space. Their eyes locked, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to still. Hughes swung with the weight of his pride, a fist aimed to shatter. Regina ducked low, driving her baton into his stomach, but he absorbed the blow, grabbing her arm with crushing force. For a moment, it seemed the tide had turned. He shoved her against the wall, his voice dripping with venom. "You don't belong here. You hear me? You will never belong." But Regina's spirit did not bend. With a surge of strength born from years of battles no one had seen, she twisted free, driving her knee into his side and slamming her forehead into his face. The impact stunned him, sending him stumbling back, blood streaking down his cheek. The fight dragged on, brutal and unforgiving, until the sound of boots thundered down the hall. Reinforcements arrived, officers pulling prisoners away, chaos erupting into order. Hughes was dragged back, still snarling threats through swollen lips. The others lay groaning, defeated, and in the center of it all stood Regina Cole, her chest heaving, her uniform torn, but her gaze unbroken. The aftermath was swift. Reports, hearings, investigations. Hughes was placed in solitary, his influence diminished. His crew faced extended sentences. But for Regina, the scars were not on her body. They were in the knowledge that she had been hunted not just as an officer, but as a black woman whose very existence and authority had provoked rage. Yet even in that, she found pride. Because she had stood, she had fought, and she had won. Not for glory, not for recognition, but for the simple, powerful truth that dignity is not granted by others. It is claimed and defended. Word of the attack spread beyond the prison. In whispers, in official reports, in the quiet admiration of those who had doubted her, Regina Cole became more than just an officer. She became a symbol of resilience, of what it meant to face down hate and refuse to be broken. In the month that followed, Regina continued her work, though the weight never lessened. Some prisoners still eyed her with resentment, but many looked at her differently now. Not all with respect. Respect in prison is a complicated currency, but with recognition. They knew she was not to be underestimated, not to be defined by the stereotypes they once clung to. And at home, when Regina sat with her mother, she finally allowed herself to speak of the fear she had felt, the violence she had endured, and the pride she carried. Her mother held her hand and said, "Baby, you've done more than survive. You've shown them what it means to live with dignity." Regina nodded, her heart heavy but steady, because she knew her story was not just her own. It was part of a larger story of every black woman who had been doubted, dismissed, or targeted, and who still chose to stand tall. The prison walls would always echo with anger, with hatred, with violence. But within those same walls, Officer Regina Cole carved out something stronger, respect born of resilience, justice carried on her shoulders, and dignity that could not be taken. She had been tested, hunted, nearly broken, and yet she endured, not as a victim, but as a fighter, a ruthless fighter, yes, but one whose greatest weapon was not her fist, nor her baton, but the unshakable truth of who she was.